I'd like to welcome everybody to the online conference Narrating the Holodomor, the Social and Cultural History of Collectivization and Famine in Soviet Ukraine, which is organized by the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. Welcome to panel 5, which is titled National Minorities During the Holodomor. We have 3 speakers at this panel. Each speaker will have 15 to a maximum of 20 minutes for their presentation. Following the presentations, the discussant will have 10 minutes. Afterward, the discussion period will commence, beginning with the presenters who will have an opportunity to engage with the discussant. Our first speaker is Rina Lapidus, is a full professor at the Faculty of the Humanities in Bar-Ilan University, Tel Aviv, Israel. She has authored or edited 12 monographs and 60 academic articles. Rina has given talks at more than 115 conferences around the world in English, Russian, and Hebrew. She's a member of 19 professional organizations and 3 editorial boards. Her presentation is titled The Holodomor in Jewish Villages and Towns in Ukraine. Rina, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Yes. My name is Rina Lapidus. I come from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, in Tel Aviv. And the title of my talk is Holodomor in Jewish Villages and Towns in Ukraine. The policy of the Soviet government extended to farmers of all nationalities, and the Jews did not escape the common fate. They wrote in the Soviet newspapers, quote, "A wealthy Jewish man, kulak, is just as malicious as a wealthy Russian, Ukrainian, or anyone else," unquote. Collectivization, as well as the widespread famine in the countryside and towns, also affected the Jews. In 1929, the collectivization of Jewish households began. Kolkhozes were joined mainly by the poor in order to improve their situation. 95% of Jewish households in the Ukraine were made into kolkhozes by 1931. Each kolkhoz had to supply grain to the state, pay off the machine tractor station, create a seed fund for further sowing, provide livestock with fodder, and if anything remained, the rest was distributed among the workers according to their number of work days. If the kolkhoz failed to fulfill the plan, punitive measures were taken. The Soviet authorities would take back the grain which the farmers had received and handed it over to cover the required norm, and took goods out of rural stores so that nothing could be bought. During the Holodomor of 1932-1933, the greatest casualties took place in the Ukrainian villages. In the opinion of most historians, the cause of the famine of 1932-33 in Ukraine, another part of the Soviet Union, was the coercive and repressive policy pursued by the communist government concerning the procurement of grain by peasants. According to the data, from 3 to 3.5 million people died from famine in Ukrainian, known as the Holodomor. The number of victims throughout the Soviet Union is estimated at 7 million. In 1932-33, there was also a mass famine in the Volga region, the Kuban region, where many ethnic Ukrainians lived, in Belarus, in the South Ural, in Western Siberia, and in Kazakhstan. About 81% of those who died of hunger in Ukraine were Ukrainians. 4.5% were Russians. 1.4% were Jews, and 1.1% were Poles. There were also many Belarusians, Bulgarians, and Hungarians among the victims. The famine did not pass over their neighbors, the Jewish farmers. There were many Jewish kolkhozes in the list of the Council of the People Commissars of the Ukraine, of the most affected by the famine. There was a huge number of Jewish artisans who worked for the rural population in the cities and towns of the Ukraine. There were tailors, shoemakers, tinsmiths, carpenters, and blacksmiths. With the outset of period of hunger, orders from neighboring farmers ceased, and the usual delivery of products to local bazaars also ceased. During the Holodomor of 1932-33, everyone was starving, and the official documents of the time confirmed this. There were many cases of malnutrition and deaths in the Jewish townships. In the Stalindorf district, quote, the situation of the collective farmers in the Voroshilov district of Jewish villages is desperate. People have stopped asking for help. They are lying in cold, unheated houses, awaiting death. Collective farmer Braverman has 4 children in his hut, aged from 5 to 10 years old. They are lying quietly and silently, without movement. They're swollen with open wounds, which suggests that they are decomposing alive, unquote. The following is an excerpt from a letter of Hannah Sharber of Berdichev, Jewish town of Berdichev, to Nadezhda Krupskaya, the widow of Vladimir Lenin. A quote, this letter is being written to you by a woman who lies in bed day after day in anticipation of death by starvation. Oh, what a feeling, what agony it is, what hell it is to starve and to know that nothing except for a vile death of starvation is to come. Help us. We still want to live and work. We do not want to starve to death. Do not let hunger defeat us, unquote. The Jewish writer Vasily Grossman, the author of the documentary book Everything Flowers, reported, quote, the old people said that there was a famine also under the Tsar Nicholas, but nevertheless, the authorities helped them. The authorities lent money. They opened free kitchens in the cities for the peasantry who fled from the countrysides. Students in the cities also collected donations for the starving peasants in the countryside. As against that, the so-called workers and peasants government, he meant the Soviet regime, did not give a grain of wheat or hay, unquote. They didn't realize that the starvation was the initiated enterprise of the communist regime. It was not a natural disaster as it was at the time of the Tsar Nicholas, when the Tsarist authorities did help common people. Now it was not a natural disaster, it was a project of the Soviet authorities. It was intended to be this way. They didn't realize it was so harsh and so cruel. They still wrote letters to Comrade Stalin. Vasily Grossman gave the following description of Holodomor in his book, Everything Flows, quote, children are crying at nights from hunger. They don't sleep. They ask for bread at night. People have faces like earth, dull eyes, as if they were drunken. The entire village has died out, unquote. Survivors related, quote, population of entire villages were dying out. First, the children were dying. After them were old people, then the middle-aged people. At first, they buried the corpses. Then they stopped burying them because the living had no strength. The bodies of the deceased remained lying in the huts and yards. It became quiet in the countryside. Everyone died. There were no survivors, unquote. The famine was also accompanied by dysentery and typhus. In the Jewish kolkhozes, people were lying in beds and benches awaiting death. The general hunger produced a sense of powerlessness and doom. Every night, trucks covered with tarpaulins collected corpses at the train stations, under bridges, in doorways. All the hospitals in the city were overcrowded, as were also the morgues. Despite the innumerable victims of the Holodomor, the Soviet authorities continued to remove grain from collective farms. The authorities also forbade local leaders to report on the consequences of their policies. Nevertheless, a district party leader reported to Vinnytsia Regional Party Committee, quote, despite your prohibition ordering one to refrain from recording and exposing the information concerning the starving people, I think it would be dishonest to conceal the horrendous data about the state of affairs in the region, unquote. Excuse me. People all over the Ukraine were dying, including Jews as well. The Jewish populations in the predominantly Jewish towns of Fastov, Proskurov, Uman, Berdichev, and Zhytomyr was gradually dying out. Carters were collecting corpses. They were driving carts along rural streets, stopping at houses with open doors, entering the house and carrying out the dead. They took them to the cemetery and buried them in mass graves. Starving Jewish peasants fled from the countryside to towns and cities in hope of obtaining a piece of bread, but in many cases in vain. Excuse me. According to official figures, in February 1933, among the corpses collected in the streets of Kiev, there were more than 900 Jews that had died of hunger. I believe that there were many more people of different nationalities. People were on the verge of revolt because of dissatisfaction about the supply of food. People didn't understand what was going on and what the situation was. There was growing dissatisfaction about the supply of food in the country. But nevertheless, informers of the governmental political bureau, which was part of the KGB of those days, were active among large population of farmers in the villages and among the inhabitants of towns. They constantly reported to their supervisors the verbal expressions and angry mood of the general public. They also reported critical statements and ideas concerning the Soviet leaders, which was the greatest offensive, I believe, in that period. And first and foremost about Joseph Stalin. Thus, there was a report concerning Samuel Rubinstein, a Jewish worker from Berdichev. Rubinstein allegedly said, quote, our regime has lost its sanity with its 5-year plan. They are only capable of issuing instructions and promising in the press that every worker will be provided with everything he needs. But in practice, we're starving and our people are dying of hunger, unquote. Also, Chaim Milman, a Jewish mechanic at a factory at the Moilov-Podolsky region, allegedly said, quote, "We all need to quit the work in the factory. It's better to live and starve without work than to work and starve," unquote. Chaim Lederson, a Jewish worker from Vinnytsia, expressed his state of mind as follows, quote, "I see no way out except to start a strike. The authorities probably want us to make an open uprising," unquote. The merchants, artisans, people without specific occupations who could not feed themselves in any other way joined Jewish collective farms located close to the townships. The new farmers were in it.
5 minutes.
Yeah, the new farmers were inexperienced and the collective farms lacked equipment. They had to introduce additional trades, mills, smiths, bakeries, but they had no grain. So they had to introduce grinders, but they had no grain to grind it. It was related of a Jewish collective farm in Ukraine. The repressions of those years did not pass by the Jewish collective farms. Newspapers and brochures reported on the so-called sabotage and thieving machinations of the class enemy in the Jewish regions as well, who supposedly penetrated the collective farm leadership and prevented, quote, the implementation of Comrade Stalin's instruction to make the collective farms communistic and prosperous, unquote. The hypocritical statements of the newspapers about Comrade Stalin, who was eager to make the situation better, but the starving people, the starving Jews, insisted on making the situation worse. Jewish organizations in America, in England, in France, and in Poland offered help. But in response, they were told that there was no hunger in the Soviet Union, and their representatives were not allowed to visit the Jewish kolkhozes in the Ukraine. Conclusion. Scholars note that the distribution of Holodomor victims by nationality corresponds to the national distribution of the rural population of Ukraine. From the data of the registry offices in the nationality of the dead, we see that in the Ukraine, people were recorded as having died on the basis of their place of residence, not nationality. Everyone was dying. It did not matter who they were, Russians, Ukrainians, Jews. Hunger was widespread. Hunger was indeed an element of terror. The further repressions of 1937, 1938 affected those who survived the Holodomor of 1932-33. That's it.
Thank you very much for keeping within the time limit. We're pressed for time, so I'll go on to the next speaker. Eduard Baidaus holds a PhD in history from the University of Alberta, where he defended the dissertation titled Nation Building and Separatism in Eastern Europe, the Transnistria Problem in Moldova and the Geopolitics of Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and the European Union 1917 to 2014. Currently, Dr. Baidaus teaches at 2 Alberta colleges He is also a postdoctoral fellow at the Holodomor Education and Research Consortium, or HREC, at our institute, the University of Alberta. His postdoctoral project centers on the Holodomor in the Ukrainian-Romanian border region, examining Romania's response to the Ukrainian famine. His presentation is titled Escaping Stalin's Paradise, Soviet Refugees in Romania during the Holodomor, 1932 to 1933. Dr. Baidaus, you have 20 minutes maximum. Unmute.
Yeah, I'm muted. So sorry. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for introduction. So my topic is Escaping Stalin's Paradise, Soviet Refugees in Romania during the Holodomor, 1932-33. Here is my outline, the questions I will be referring to: introduction, objectives, sources, historical context, refugees, the escape, once on the Romanian soil, some testimonies, and some preliminary conclusions. My presentation has some images to feed the content, so I will not make comments on them now. But if anyone would like to ask me for a comment for any image or content, please ask me during the questions answer session. So introduction, objectives and sources. This paper examines a relatively under-researched topic. Well, I said relatively because there are some works, but when I read or hear presentations about famine in Ukraine, the refugees who try to escape to Romania are barely mentioned. So building on unexplored material and existing studies, my project attempts to answer a number of questions, among which what were the preconditions and causes that made Soviet citizens in this region consider leaving the USSR, who were those who tried to escape, what survival strategy and means they did employ to cross the border, and what did they tell Romanians once on the Romanian soil. So sources, there are Romanian and Soviet archival documents, Romanian police reports, interrogation reports, informative notes, some print media, magazines, newspapers, journals, and similar Soviets, part in Soviet officials' reports, letters, official speeches, telegrams, and some print media, newspapers, and journals. And here is an image of one of the so-called dossier or file of Ministry of Internal Affairs of Romania. So the context. Well, historically, relations between Russians and Romanians were not, let's say, positive, with some exceptions. And they get even worse after, in 1918, Romania incorporated Bessarabia after the Union of March 1918, creating the so-called Great Romania. So because of Romania, the Soviet Union broke off any relations with Romania until 1934, and any questions to be discussed and solved were made through the so-called Soviet-Romanian Mixed Boundary Commission. Like Poles, Romanians could also offer a safe place for the potential fugitives from the Stalin's paradise before and during the collectivization and famine. This, of course, caused additional tensions between the countries. So Soviet borders, politics, and geopolitics, claiming Bessarabia, and here is Bessarabia. The Soviets, they created the so-called Moldavian Piedmont. Well, they called it Moldavian Autonomous Republic within Soviet Ukraine in 1924. Ethnic composition was about 30 Romanian-speaking Moldavians, almost 50% were Ukrainians, and the rest were Russians, Bulgarians, Jews, Poles, and others. Tiraspol was the capital right here on the border. De facto, de jure, it was considered by the Soviets Chisinau to be temporarily occupied by the Romanians. The river Dnestr was to Soviets a temporary demarcation line. It wasn't considered like a state border. State border was considered here on the Prut River because Bessarabia was seen as part of the Soviet Union. And to Romanians, the Dnestr River was international state border. So Soviet refugees in Romania, who, why, and how? Well, who attempt to escape? Social status and occupation, kulaks, or they called in Romanian language kulaci or chiaburi, and their relatives. well-to-do farmers, poor peasants, and even collective farmers members. Ethnic composition varies. Well, Romanian-speaking dominated because the villages of Romanian-speaking Moldavians were on the border. You can see here from the last names, Surcan, Barb, Cătăreu, Rotar, Munteanu were Romanian last names. Then you can see here Ribalco, Christenko, Ivanchenko, which are Ukrainians, followed by Zakharov, Tomov, Ignatiev, Karpov, Stom, and others. But the lack of the language wasn't a problem, wasn't a barrier if those who didn't know the language. What mattered? It mattered that Romanians were willing to accept and help Soviet refugees from starvation and death, like an example of 9-year-old Anna Matvienko, who crossed the border to unite with her father, who escaped into Romania 2 years earlier. So the location of the villages, as I said, were on the close to the Nes River, like the names of the villages you can see here, both in Romanian and in Ukrainian, like Botuchen, Jura, Kochieri, Koshnitsa, Katerinivka, Nizaretailivka, and others. So why to leave the paradise? Well, overall, the causes and preconditions which pushed the population in Moldavian Republic to break the law, so to say, were similar to the rest of Ukraine. Forced deprivation of land, collectivization, kolkhozes, heavy taxation, the collection of cash contributions to purchase machines, which was imposed on peasants by Soviet economic agents like Kooptach, poultry cooperatives, the shortage of food, despair and pressure from the side of the local authorities, and of course, the proximity with Romania. And here we can see a map of Soviet Ukraine, where Bessarabia was part of Soviet Ukraine, and the border was right here on the Prut River. So what do the documents say? Well, a person called Leshchinsky, who represented a bank in Rayon, called to reap everyone, not a single Serednyak is to be left alone in the village of Korzhova, just on the border with Romania. Nikita Rotari, a former collective farmer, stated, let them have as many guards as they want to, let them murder us, but we can no longer starve. The kolkhoz took our horses away, where they all perished, and we cannot sow anymore. It is all the same where we die, on the border with Romania or here in the village. A woman, Alexandra Dobrescu, a mother of 5, whose husband left for Kiev to find some job, said, there is no difference where we perish, here or on the Nes River. Suppose they kill us, so it to be. But if they do not kill us, we will survive in Bessarabia. After all, they did not kill everyone who escaped. So, for instance, in the village of Katerinivka, Kamenka Rayon, the starving peasants were told by local authorities, go and find bread in Bessarabia if they want to feed the children. And what is interesting, this village was almost completely populated by Ukrainians. So they escaped the river, they killed and saved. How many and what did they do? Well, they preferred winter and summer. Winter, nets would freeze. Summer, swimming or rowing across the river. Time, mostly in the late evenings or during the nights. The means, different. Rafts, boats, even saucer balls. A person, 45 years old, Grigory Warnik, a widow of Serednyak, he crossed the river with his 5 children using a large oblong box, which looked like a coffin. How many per group, per attempt? From 1 person to groups of 6, 26, or 60. Children, adults, elderly. There is a question how many? And as of today, I can say the data I found, a person named Ion Dumitrascu, a refugee himself, mentioned 25,000 people, 20,000 people. An Italian scholar, Alberto Massiani, relies also on this figure, 20,000, but I think it should be double checked. So what did Nkvd borders do? Well, they try to prevent the escapees to cross the border. They try to stop them, but when it didn't work, people wouldn't stop. They will run all directions, or just to escape, they will open the fire, shoot them. And in one occasion, they even machine gunned a group of 60. About 40 were killed. So what is interesting, bodyguards, Romanians and Soviets, they will talk to each other sometimes. And sometimes Romania will ask, like in this case, a bodyguard of Nkvd named Brovkin, why the USSR, where the power belonged to the peasants, does not allow them to come to Romania, where the life was better? Well, I didn't find an answer to this question, but we know. So Sandor Warner, a Romanian journalist, wrote in 1934, dozens and hundreds of refugees cannot save themselves from the Soviet bullets. One can see on the Dniester River the corpse of men, women, and frozen children. So once on Romanian soil, what did they say? Well, Pavel Panchenko in Chobrchu village, he said that he was obliged to deliver to the state a lot of products. You can see here some data. And if not, then he will be fined and also prosecuted according to penal legislation. Another person who escaped, Ion Ketereu, he said, well, we ended up receiving only 5% of harvest. The rest was taken by the state for export and for army. And the village was doomed to starve because afterwards they took everything. They imposed contributions on chicken, eggs, butter, and milk. So how did Romanians react to the refugees? Most were accepted. Families or members of the families who did not get killed by the Soviets while escape, also individual persons, but not everyone was accepted. So in some cases, they would send some of them back via the mixed Soviet-Romanian Commission. Why? Well, individuals did not present some interest to Romanian intelligence service, had no relatives in Romania, or were suspected most often as being Soviet spies. So what did the Romanians do, in fact, to help those people? They provided food, clothing, shelter, children's schooling, and so on, regardless of their ethnicity and spoken language, except Jews. You can see here a question mark, because I found interesting information about Jews and they escaped to Romania and the situation of Jews during the Holodomor in this Moldavian Republic, which will be a direction of my research. Some preliminary conclusion, well, thanks to the refugees from Ukraine and Romania, we can learn new details concerning collectivization and famine in this Soviet borderland. The time, season, and means for the escape were preliminarily considered by those who plan to avoid collectivization, stay safe because of decollectization, and survive the Holodomor. Most of the escapes lived in the villages located on the border with Romania. Romanian-speaking Moldavians outnumber the representatives of other ethnic groups who attempt also to escape. However, the proximity with Romania provided equal opportunities to escape from Stalin's paradise to individuals regardless of their ethnic belonging, Ukrainians, Russians, and others. Romanians did not accept all refugees. The acceptance of the latter was selective and dependent on various factors: political, propagandistic, and family relationship. And the second part of conclusions, the Dniester River as a natural and geopolitical border, its proximity to a state free from the communist ideology created necessary preconditions for escape plans. Well, just knowing that some miles away in Romania or in Poland, there was a real chance to get some food, benefit from freedom, and foresee the prospect of a better life, this induced Soviet peasants to risk their own lives, just not to die from starvation or persecution. The Nkvd border guards resorted on any measures to stop the escapees. I don't see here. I'm not sure if I have still some time, but this was a sort of overview and summary of my paper. If someone would like to read the whole paper, the draft, I can send it. So once again, thank you for organizing this conference, and I'm done. Hopefully I didn't go over the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Baidaus. You made your presentation in record time, so we're not as pressed for time as we would otherwise be. The next speaker is Colin Neufeldt. He is a professor of history at Concordia University in Edmonton. His research focuses the history of Mennonites in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Recent publications on topics in this research area are on Mennonite collective farm chairmen in the Chortytsia and Molochinsk German national districts in Ukraine, 1928 to 1934, the role of Mennonites in organizing collective farms, and Mennonite collaboration during the Nazis' occupation in World War II. His presentation today is titled From Ethnic Germans into Fascists, Hitlerists, and Nazi Agents, Holodomor Narratives, and the Transmogrification of Mennonites into Nazi Enemies of the State. Dr. Neufeldt, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, conference hosts and participants. I very much enjoyed the presentation so far. Last year, I gave a presentation on Hitler, Mennonites, and the Holodomor at the National Minorities of Soviet Ukraine during the Holodomor conference that was held in Kiev. And that presentation really looked at the experience of Mennonites from the top down, primarily how international events and specifically the decisions and policies of the Soviet and Nazi regimes affected the Mennonite experience. Today, I'm going to be looking at the experience of Mennonites from the bottom up. That is, by looking at their narratives, we're going to be looking at how they saw themselves, especially their relationship to the regime change, primarily in 1933, where they start off as ethnic Germans, and by the end of that year, they start to really become viewed as potential Nazi enemies of the state. And so that's what we're going to be looking at primarily today. So some background information. The Mennonites, of course, arrived in Ukraine during the time of Catherine the Great. They had a number of colonies. The first was Khortytsa, near Zaporozhye. The second colony was Volachna, which had 60 villages northeast of Melitopol. By 1914, there were at least 33 Mennonite colonies with more than 180 some villages. The population in Ukraine was around 75,000 Mennonites in 1914 and about just over 56,000 Mennonites in 1925. And so with Kornizatsiya in the 1920s, the Mennonites were able to have two national districts. One was Khortytsa with 44,000 hectares, and Molochansk with just over 174,000 hectares. So here's a map. As you can see, I'm not a very good cartographer, but it gives you an idea of some of the larger ethnic minority settlements in Ukraine. And the ones with the blue dots represent ethnic German settlements. And the ones with the blue dots and the red crosses represent the larger Mennonite settlements. And so, of course, there are many other Mennonite settlements that are scattered throughout Ukraine, but these are the larger ones. The one with the arrow pointing down is the Khortytsa colony, which is the first colony that was established. And the one with the arrow that's pointing up is Molochansk or Molachna, and that was the second colony that was established. So it's important to understand how Soviet leaders viewed the Mennonites, because that very much determined their experience. Mennonites initially, right after the Soviets came to power, defined themselves as Dutch, but from very early on, the Soviet leaders viewed them as German-speaking ethno-religious sect. And of course, they included, Mennonites included kulak, counter-revolutionaries, expertniki, which was a common term that was used especially in the 1930s, bivshi, sectarians, religious fanatics, and enemies of the regime. And that was primarily because of the Mennonites' pre-revolutionary wealth, their support for the German army during World War I, and also the White Army to a greater or lesser extent, depending which area, during the Russian Civil War. And also because Mennonites had organized Selbstschutz, or self-defense corps, to defend their communities against anarchists, primarily Bakhno, and also the Red Army. Not surprisingly, many Mennonites, especially those who were very religious or wealthy, viewed the Bolsheviks with suspicion and had trouble accepting the new atheistic Bolshevik government. But over time, some Mennonites came to accept the new Bolshevik regime. Others, of course, did not. As pacifists, many Mennonites passively resisted against the regime by emigrating. And by 1929, almost 20,000 Soviet Mennonites emigrated to the West, mostly to Canada and to South America. There were also, however, some Mennonites in Ukraine who actively supported the Bolsheviks from very early on. They participated in the organization and operation of kolkhozy, Soviet institutions, including village and district Soviets, committees of the village poor, and some, not a lot, but some also became Communist Party and Komsomol members in the 1920s and 1930s. And so that was part of their experience as well. So these Mennonites who worked for the regime served as the Soviet government's foot soldiers in identifying, disenfranchising, dispossessing, and also incarcerating Mennonite kulaks and other enemies of the state, as well as non-Mennonite kulaks and state enemies during collectivization and dekulakization. So that means Ukrainians, Jews, and others. So that they were part of that process as well. They weren't just working with Mennonite kulaks and enemies of the state. By the spring of 1930, every Mennonite community in Ukraine was collectivized, and by the time the 1932-33 famine arrived, many Mennonite-populated kolkhozy had experienced poor agricultural production results, declining livestock herds, and desperate living conditions. During the Holodomor, Mennonites shared many of the same challenges and tribulations as their Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, and Polish neighbors. But what also aggravated the Mennonite Holodomor experience at this time was the increasing anti-German hostility and anti-sectarian hostility that pervaded in their communities, especially after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. So what are the narratives that I look at? So giving this bottom-up perspective of the Mennonite experience. So I look at Hungerbriefe, which are hunger letters. I also look at minutes of kolkhoz meetings, primarily kolkhozy that were populated by Mennonites. Also minutes of village and district Soviets, government organizations, committees of the village poor, and Communist Party organizations where Mennonites worked and where they were employed. I also looked at minutes of the meetings of committees and troikas for Communist Party Chiska or Purge that took place in 1933 and continued in 1934, actually right up until 1935. And then I also looked at some German newspapers. So these are the sources of the narratives that I looked at for this paper. So the Hungerbriefe, or the hunger letters, these are located in archives, Mennonite newspapers, and reports of B.H. Unruh, who was a Mennonite liaison in Karlsruhe, Germany. And I'll talk a little bit more about him a little bit later on. And so in essence, there are really two types of hunger letters. Most of these letters are these longer letters that were sent to relatives, Mennonite churches, Mennonite pastors, Mennonite aid agencies in North America and Western Europe, primarily Germany and Holland. And these longer letters, they describe the life and death conditions in Mennonite populated areas. They were often very desperate pleas for food and for foreign currency. There are also acknowledgements of gratitude of foreign aid, which often included references to the food that they received, including flour, sugar, salted pork, pasta, powdered milk, and occasionally references to coffee. They also are acknowledgements of gratitude for the foreign currency that they received, and also credit vouchers that they could use to be redeemed at Torxen stores where they could buy goods. These hunger letters are also infused with religious images and apocalyptic themes, reflecting the hope that Christ will soon return to bring about an end to their suffering. In many respects, these hunger letters are also the last wills and testaments of Mennonites on the verge of death. So here's an example of these letters. This one here, which is from Elizabeth Dirks, is actually easy to read. You can, if you know any German, you can actually read the text relatively easily. And a lot of these letters, as I said before, these longer ones are, anywhere from 2 to 3 to 5 pages long. Many of the letters are also written in the Goethische Schrift, which for the historian, if you're not familiar with it, can be a challenge. I'm sure it was also challenging for Soviet censors to figure out what this is all about. But these letters in the Goethische Schrift also, kind of give you a sense of what Mennonites were experiencing at this time. Now, the second type of letters, hunger letters, I call Bittebriefe or petitions. And these are short petitions, usually a page, often on a postcard, written by Mennonite adults and also children, often orphans, who are writing for help. These are very brief descriptions of the desperate living and food conditions that they're experiencing. Sometimes they discuss the illness of family members, separation from their family members, especially those who have been exiled, as well as their faith in God. They're sent to Mennonite and non-Mennonite relief organizations in Germany, United States, or Canada. And many of them are also sent to B.H. Unruh, this Mennonite representative from Karlsruhe, Germany. So this gives you an example of what these Bitterbriefe look like. And this one here is written in particular by two Mennonite orphans, Frida and Mitzi, and they were in Orlov in the Molochansk community. They were the ages of 13 or 11, and they're talking about their desperate conditions. And so on the one side of the Bitterbrief is their petition, and on the other side, of course, is the address, the postcard that they used to send in this case, they were sending it to Rotterdam. This is another Bitterbrief. And these Bitterbriefs often, because they're often included on postcards, they give you a sense of some of the Soviet postcards that were used at the time. So in these Mennonite hunger letters and in these very short petitions, there's no mention of Hitler. There's no mention of Nazism. There's no support for the Nazis. There's no mention of Nazi aid agencies. They only refer sometimes to Hilfskommittee or health committees. There's also no mention of any kind of contacts with German consulates or any kind of German or Nazi agencies. And so these letters are really just petitions, and there's nothing in them, at least the ones that I've seen, and I can't speak for every letter, but the ones that I've seen don't really, link these Mennonite petitioners to the Nazis. They're not seeking support from the Nazi regime. But of course, these letters later on will be used as evidence of their conspiracy to work with the Nazi regime. I should mention that very few letters survive after the spring of 1933. I'm not sure if it's because of censorship. I know when I was working in archives, I sometimes saw some of these letters in there. So I'm not sure if the censors took these letters and prevented them from being sent to Europe. I want to talk a little bit about B.H. Unruh. He was a Mennonite representative and leader living in Germany. He received many of these hunger letters and petitions. He was also a Nazi sympathizer and contributed funds to the Nazi SS. And during the Holodomor, it appears that Unruh and other Mennonite leaders forwarded Mennonite addresses from these hunger letters to Nazi and non-Nazi aid agencies that ship food and parcels to the Soviet Union. And so as a result, this is the connection, I believe, that happens, that because Mennonites were, in Europe, were trying to get aid to their co-religionists, they were using whatever means they could. And if that meant sending addresses to Nazi agencies or non-Nazi agencies, so be it, as long as the food was getting over there. And so as a result, it's really, I think, this connection in Europe, in Western Europe, and primarily in Germany, that links these Soviet Mennonites to some of these Nazi organizations in terms of the aid relief that they received in 1933. So I now want to talk about another type of narrative, the minutes, I should say, of kolkhoz meetings. And in many of the Mennonite populated kolkhozi, Mennonites worked at every level of the kolkhoz administration and hierarchy. They served in positions such as the kolkhoz chairman, all the way down to the lowly field hands. And so the administration of these kolkhozi required numerous meetings, and many of these meetings are documented with minutes and accompanying records. In many cases, the secretaries who prepared these minutes were Mennonites who narrate the Mennonite kolkhoz experience. And so I consider these minutes to be, of course, also narratives, because these are Mennonites writing about their kolkhoz experience within the kolkhoz. There are four types of kolkhoz meeting minutes and records. The first one is the minutes of the kolkhoz executive, which included the kolkhoz chairman, secretary, and accountant. And in some of these Mennonite kolkhozes, these are all occupied by Mennonites themselves. Sometimes you'll have also in attendance village activists or brigadiers. Once in a while, you'll see the name of a political commissar. There's also the meeting minutes of the revision or the audit committee, and often these were officed by, these were Mennonites that served in this position as well. There's, of course, the minutes of the meetings of the Kolkhoz General Assembly. These are the minutes of the entire Kolkhoz membership, where they discuss all kinds of issues, including how we're going to apportion the last amount of food in the Kolkhoz. In many cases, they're pretty well all Mennonites that are participating in these General Assembly meetings. And there's also the minutes and records of meetings of Kolkhoz subcommittees. So there's the meeting minutes of Kolkhoz brigadiers, women's organizations, Komsomol members. So among other things, these minutes provide on-the-ground daily, weekly accounts of how the famine was affecting Mennonite populated Kolkhozy. They also provide the decisions and responses of the Kolkhozy to government directives and procurement demands, the dire food crisis, and the request to admit, discipline, and expel Kolkhoz members. In the last half of 1933, there's also a noticeable change in the minutes of the Kolkhoz meetings. Now they begin to characterize Mennonite scapegoats for the failures of their Kolkhozy, not just as kulaks or as white guardists or whatever. They also start using the term Hitlerists, fascists, and Nazi agents. So you see this, that the minutes of these meetings really, in many respects, require Kolkhoz members to regularly and publicly disclose any foreign aid, currency, or correspondence they've received from the West. They require and direct that there be searches of Kolkhoz households suspected of receiving foreign assistance. They want people to denounce any Kolkhoznik who received anything from the West, to send back to Germany all foreign aid to feed oppressed and starving workers in Germany. They also direct that Kolkhoz members be prohibited from attending Torxen stores to buy goods. And they also authorize the expulsion and arrest of Kolkhoz members who receive money or goods from outside the USSR. And this is often—
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So for many Mennonite Kolkhoznik, these are allegations that they were Hitlerists, fascists, and Nazi agents must have come as a complete surprise, because few of them appear to, at least in the letters, appear to know anything about who Hitler was or who the Nazis were or understood what they represented. But these Nazi labels add significant new challenges to Mennonite life and survival in Ukraine, a challenge that many non-Mennonites in Ukraine don't have to deal with at this stage of the Holodomor. They're not being accused of being Nazis. Now, there are 3 other sources I just want to briefly summarize. There's, of course, the local government and Communist Party organizations, and in many Mennonite populated areas, Mennonites served as officials in these bodies. And once again, Mennonites their names appear on their minutes, and in some cases, Mennonites are serving as secretaries of these bodies. And once again, by mid-1933, you start seeing in these minutes of these organizations warnings that Hitlerists, Nazi agents, and fascists had infiltrated Kolkhozy, but also government bodies, Communist Party cells. And so this is an enormous challenge for them, because now these Mennonite authorities, they are Mennonites, and now they potentially can be identified as Nazi agents. And so their families, their relatives, they're all potential targets. And that makes it very difficult for these Mennonite officials to do their job, because they're now preoccupied with saving their own lives. They're really not able to represent Mennonite interests in important government decisions because they're worried about being labeled as a Nazi. They're expected to demonstrate all kinds of loyalty to the regime, even with respect to decisions that really harm Mennonites. In some cases, Mennonite Kolkhozy are expected to deliver or surrender large tracts of land to government agencies in Ukrainian Kolkhozy. And so that's really a disadvantage. And they're also expected to investigate and arrest fellow Mennonites accused of receiving foreign aid or supporting the Nazi cause. There's also Mennonite narratives during the 1933-35 Chiska, the purge. And so it's during this process that the purge starts in 1933. And initially it's really a purge that focuses on the Communist Party and Komsomol organizations. But by 1934, this purge spreads to other organizations. And it's really, they undertake these so-called verification, proverka, trials to identify and expel party elements, class alien elements, duplicitous elements, enemies of the state. But they also start targeting so-called Hitlerists, Nazis, fascist agents. And I don't want to say that this purge is just about Mennonites. When you look at the records, there are many Ukrainians that are being purged at this stage. You know, this is just after the Holodomor is coming to an end. You see these purges taking place in the villages, and you see Ukrainian names, you see Jewish names of people being purged. But often when it comes to Mennonites, they're being purged because of their kind of connections with the West. And they're being accused of, they're being accused of being, you know, working as Nazi agents. And so in some cases, the authorities complained that at least 40% of the local Kolkhoz population and at least 90% of the inhabitants in some communities are either kulaks or Hitlerists. And so this makes it enormously challenging for Mennonites because not only are they kulaks, but now they're potentially allies of the Nazi regime. And so you have people from all kinds of organizations, Mennonites being expelled from all kinds of organizations, not just Communist Party organizations, but all kinds of committees, machine tractor stations, and of course, kolkhozing. There's one other source I just want to briefly mention, and that's German language newspapers. In these newspapers, which of course are produced by the Soviet regime, they're very interesting. They provide all kinds of interesting information. I've got a sample. I've got a sample of it here, of one of them that I used. Stürmer. This is a newspaper that was produced in the Chortitza area. So typically on the first page, you have all kinds of national news, usually about Stalin or about important leaders. And on the second page, you have specific stories identifying both heroes of the Soviet state, those who did remarkable accomplishments in terms of the work they performed, but also enemies of the state. And those who are kulaks, those who are sabotaging. And what's very interesting is in these newspaper articles, you find very few references to Germany, and you find references to the poorest conditions of German workers, but you don't find any stories about Mennonites in Chortitza being Hitlerists or Mennonites being Nazis. And this is from 1934. This is after the campaign.
Can I ask you to wrap up?
Sure. This is after the campaign has started. So I found it very interesting that in this newspaper, there's no mention of Mennonites as Hitlerists and Nazi agents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Neufeldt. We are now turning to hear from the discussant. Dr. Andrey Shlyakhter received his PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 2020 with the dissertation Smuggler States, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Contraband Trade Across the Soviet Frontier, 1919 to 1924. He's currently the Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellow in Eastern European Jewish Studies at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, where he is working on his first book, Smuggling Across the Soviet Borders, Contraband Trades, Soviet Solutions, and the Shadow Economic Origins of the Iron Curtain, 1917 to 1932. He has been a Peter Jacek and Hrek visiting scholar in Holodomor studies at the University of Toronto, and is planning in 2022 to continue his Holodomor-related research in Soviet Ukraine's western border districts as a CIUS and Hrek research grantee at the Security Service Archive in Kyiv. Dr. Shlyakhter, you have 10 minutes, and after which we'll open up the floor to discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to skip the standard step of summarizing these papers and just jump right into what I found most interesting and problematic in each one. And I trust that some common themes between the papers will emerge. So I'll start with Eduard's paper, which is closest to my own research focus. As Eduard points out, the experience of the Holodomor on the Romanian frontier is not well understood. And certainly it's been less illuminated than the Polish frontier. There are multiple reasons for this, but I suspect that the language barrier is one of the major ones. While Ukrainian speakers can get by in Polish sources, Romanian poses a much greater obstacle. And this is one reason the contribution of Moldovan scholars such as Eduard is so valuable. because they straddle the two worlds, both in terms of linguistic ability and in terms of exposure to scholarship and sources from both sides of the Dniester and Prut. So in his paper, Eduard mines both Romanian and Soviet archival materials held in Moldovan archives, and also draws on contemporary Romanian press. Among these periodicals, he discovered an entirely new source, at least to me, the magazine Realitatea Ilustrată, which published in April 1932 an expose about the flight of refugees across the Dniester, accompanied by some 14 photographs. Now, given the real dearth of photographic evidence of the Holodomor relative to the scale of the tragedy, this is a very valuable discovery. And I only wish that Eduard had included more of those images, harrowing though I'm sure they are. Another crucial point that Eduard raises is the level of collectivization in the border districts compared to the interior ones. Data he cites in his paper indicate that by April 1932, the border districts were considerably less collectivized. This is, of course, a hugely important dimension of Soviet policy. My impression is that this policy was pursued inconsistently. Sometimes border districts were privileged and therefore not collectivized as rapidly as interior ones. Sometimes there was a push to collectivize the border districts more intensively. This needs to be explored much more systematically. I think the MAPA project at Harvard is a good source. But also the impact of collectivization levels on famine outcomes itself is unclear because independent farmers suffered special requisitions. There's much more to explore here. Then there's the question of the origins of the escapees. Did they come from the border villages or from further into the interior? Mortality was certainly greater further east, so one would expect to see a greater number of people willing to hazard the journeys to the border and the crossing, to have a greater number of people to have come from these interior districts. But on the other hand, as Eduard mentions, the border villagers have the advantage of local knowledge of the terrain, especially important at night. And I would add, enjoyed extensive past experience with smuggling. So I think a lot more to explore there. Rina's paper brushes against what I think are some key issues on the Jewish experience in the Holodomor, but it doesn't really make them explicit. So I'll identify a couple that I think are. As Yuri Slyoskin, among others, has pointed out, most Soviet Jews were not communists, and most Soviet communists were not Jews. But Jews were disproportionately represented in the most visible leadership ranks of the party, which left the entire community vulnerable to scapegoating. The sociologist Victor Karady has observed that within minority communities, unlike within majority ones, the entire community is held responsible for the actions of individual members by the majority community. So the Holodomor surely reinforced anti-Semitic sentiments, even as Rina reminds us, Jews suffered too. But being primarily concentrated in towns and cities, Jews, like the rest of the urban population, suffered dramatically fewer casualties than did Ukrainian peasants. The visible difference in suffering, too, must have contributed to enduring anti-Semitic resentment. And finally, Jews were helped to a significant extent by relatives abroad, especially in the United States, who sent money to the Torksin stores where their relatives in Ukraine could obtain provisions. And this, too, likely strained relations. It helped Ukrainian Jews survive, but these resentments endured and animated some of the deadly animus that would reemerge only several years later. So this is a story of shared victimhood and successive victimizations. But what about mutual assistance? Surely there were Jews who helped Ukrainians survive the Holodomor, just as there were Ukrainians who saved Jews from the Holocaust. Reclaiming those stories, I think, is both historically vital and indeed socially valuable. Now, with Colin's paper, I unfortunately did not have much time, only got it yesterday, and I wasn't able to comment quite as extensively, but it just a couple points. It brings in an invaluable corpus of German language sources, and this I think especially important, transcends the simplistic state/victim paradigm by hinting at the role of local Mennonite officials in implementing Soviet policies. And in this, I see fruitful potential for comparison with Jews. Like those Jews who joined the party, Mennonite party members had presumably distanced themselves from the religious Christian element of their identity, but surely continued to identify with the ethnic and cultural community. And like Jews, Mennonites drew on considerable help from abroad. Unlike Jews, however, they had the misfortune of drawing help from Nazi Germany, which, as Colin reminds us, led quickly to deadly consequences. So I'll stop there. I might have more to add in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Before we open the floor for discussion to the general audience, we'd like to give our panelists a chance to interact with the discussant. Do you have any, do any of the panelists want to come in at this point?
If I may jump in, given that we don't have too much time and we have the possibility to get in touch via email or other means, well, thank you very much for discussing my paper. And I am a sort of novice in this field. It's a pilot project. And as I mentioned in one of my presentations a few years ago on this topic, there is a lot. There is really a lot unexplored. And if sometimes we hear about unexplored, under-researched, I believe this topic is one of those to be on the top of the list with under-researched topics. And I like the point, and I should look into this about smuggling. It's a good point. And I remember your presentation given this year earlier, which actually was very helpful to myself understand the role of the, landscape, nature, borders, rivers, during the Holodomor, before the Holodomor, during the collectivization. So thank you. And I, once again, thank you for today and for our early contacts via email for helping me in my first draft of this paper.
I too want to echo my thanks. I appreciate your comments, and I look forward to working with all of you on various topics as well.
Okay. Very good. Okay, we can now continue. If the panelists don't have anything more to say at this time, we can now turn to the questions from the general audience. And I'd like to ask the audience to please use the chat function on the Zoom program to leave your questions. And from what I see, we have quite a few questions already. So, and sorry for rushing everyone, but Dr. Shlyakhter has to leave early, and we wanted to make sure that he got his comments in and that everyone had a chance to respond to them. So the first question, it's a question for Rina. Were many Ukrainians, Russians, and ethnic Germans in the Jewish national districts and collective farms of Ukraine, such as Kalinendorf, Novozlatopol, and Stalindorf. How did their experiences during the Holodomor correlate? And this is from Yuri Kaparulin.
I believe that there was no difference. As I said, the hunger, starvation was killing everyone. People were dying. They didn't distinguish between nationalities. I believe, as I read, the people were hanging out with faces like us and eyes dull as if they were drunken. I believe there were no difference by nationality at all. And there is another question to me, how in the Holodomor is remembered in contemporary Israel. I have to admit that Holocaust is much more remembered in contemporary Israel than Holodomor. because as far as we know, 6 million Jews perished in the European Holocaust, and 2,245,000 Jews in the Soviet Union, and not counting the million of Jews who died within a few months after the end of the Holocaust. After the end of the Second World War, in my institution, there is a building dedicated to a Jewish girl of 9 years old who was freed from a concentration camp and died 3 months after she was freed. And the building, one of the buildings of the Central Library is dedicated to our university by her parents. So many buildings and many departments and hospitals in Israel are dedicated in memory of perished children, perished brothers during the Holocaust. So Holocaust is everywhere in Israel. Also, after the Civil War, after the October Revolution of 1918, there was civil war in the young Soviet Union, as we know, Soviet Russia, and it was accompanied by huge pogroms of Jews. Everybody was killing Jews, the whites and the reds, and this event is also remembered, but not Holodomor. Holodomor is mainly accepted as Ukrainian, the Ukrainian tragedy. And it is remembered as actually the Ukrainian tragedy. It is remembered much more. It is remembered as a Ukrainian tragedy. It does, but not as a Jewish tragedy.
Thank you. Well, we have some more questions here. There's a general question posed by Frank Sisson. I don't know who would want to tackle this. Should you be using Soviet Russia instead of Soviet Union for 1934? Is that directed to anyone in particular? I don't know.
I may answer it briefly.
Go ahead.
This is one of the questions which my students usually confuse, Imperial Russia, Soviet Russia, USSR, Russian Federation. And what I'm saying to them, if we speak of 1934, in my opinion, we can speak of USSR or Soviet Union, as this state was created in 1922 in December based on 4 republics. But in historiography, in the Western narrative, before World War II and during the Cold War, usually you can see Soviet Russia. So, but as I explained to my students, at the time, 1934 and later, starting with 1922, it wasn't only Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia was part of USSR, alongside with Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Belarus, and the Soviet Transcaucasian republics. That's the way I see.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question here. The next question for Rina again. How important are the articles of Harry Lang in Forwards and his wife, Lucy Robbins Lang, Tomorrow is Beautiful, in the Jewish population of Ukraine during the Great Famine? How is this source viewed by Jewish scholars on the history of Jews in the USSR and of the Holodomor?
As I mentioned, Holodomor is mainly remembered as a Ukrainian tragedy. So Jews were the minority, very little minority. I have to admit it, during Holodomor. I could not present other talk, but only about Jews, because the field of my specialization is Jewish studies. And that's what I did. But actually, Holodomor is accepted as Ukrainian catastrophe. There is no deficit of Jewish catastrophism history, but probably not Holodomor. Okay. There are plenty of Jewish catastrophes. The last Holocaust of 80 years ago was not the first one in the history of the Jewish people, when the entire Jewish population was exterminated. There were every few hundred years we have the next extermination of the Jews, and I'm afraid it's not the end yet. So Holodomor is mainly accepted as a Ukrainian tragedy.
Okay, we'll move on now to the question for Colin Neufeldt. How much research is conducted in Germany on either the Mennonites and German settlements in Ukraine during the Holodomor or on the Volga Germans during the Soviet famine?
So in Germany, there's actually a number of scholars that have been working on the ethnic German experience in Ukraine. And so there's a lot more research on ethnic Germans in general. And there's also a number of Ukrainian scholars that have been working on that. With respect to Mennonites, the group of people that are working on it is much smaller. And those that do work on it, typically those are interested in it because they're Mennonites. And unfortunately, not all of them read Russian or Ukrainian. And so typically their sources are primarily just whatever's in German. And so that limits the interpretations, it limits the perspectives of the Holodomor when you're only looking at primarily German sources, and that includes the letters that we were looking at, but also, diaries and that. And so as a result, a lot of the Mennonite scholarship, there are some scholars, some new scholars that are, that have learned the languages and are starting to work in the archives in Ukraine and have learned those languages. And so over time, I think there'll be more of us that will provide a broader perspective than what's been the case in the past. But in Germany and in Ukraine, there are a number of scholars that have just specialized on ethnic Germans in general.
Okay. And there is a question coming to Eduard Baidaus. Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that Romania didn't accept refugees at the time. Apologies if I misunderstood. What was the fate of those escapees who managed to cross the Dniester into Romania? Were they returned back to the USSR? This is from Natalia Lazar. Natalia Lazar, is it? Or is it Mark Tom?
It's from Natalia.
Natalia, okay, yes.
I think it was a sort of misunderstanding, maybe because I mentioned, on the contrary, Romania did accept refugees, but that acceptance was very selective. Okay, so and what happened to those who were not accepted? Well, according to the documents I read, some of them, not all, and I don't understand why not all, but many of them were sent to prison to serve a term as person who violated the border or Romanian border. They will spend about a month. They will be called in court, and the court will decide to leave them, to let them stay in Romania, or to send them back to Soviet Union via this mixed commission, Soviet-Romanian commission. And there was a case of a young fellow who actually did not represent any interest to Romanians. He had no relatives. His last name was Markov. He claimed he was a Moldavian or Romanian, but who knows if he was or not. Judging with the last name, it doesn't sound Romanian. So they decided to send him back. And what he did, he just ran away from the Romanian authorities, and he hid himself somewhere in Bessarabia. I couldn't find a track what happened with him next. But speaking with my colleagues, friends in Moldova today, just recently, one person mentioned to me that his grandfather was given a couple of people from what they call Transnistria, or from Soviet Ukraine, who were refugees, to help in his individual farm. So when the Soviets came in 1940, they arrested his grandfather and sent him to Siberia. So I believe that Nkvd, they were tracking the people who moved from one side to another side. And what happened to those who were returned back to Soviet Union? The documents I read so far, they don't tell what happened to them. Were they sent to Gulag, they were shot, or were sent to prison? Something did happen to them, but I cannot say as of today.
Okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question from Roman Serbin regarding the Langs. It's regarding their testimony or their writings on the Soviet Union. Are there any? Is there familiarity with the among scholars with their writings? Are they known? That would be, I think, the question to Dr. Lapidus.
I apologize.
About the source, I think, or the writings of Harry Lang and Lucy Robbins. Are they well known in Israel? Are they among scholars?
I believe they're known to the researchers of Ukrainian history.
Okay. Okay.
And not the researchers of Jewish history.
Yes. I have a question myself to all of the panelists, and it seems that one of the ways that families were able to survive through the Holodomor period was if they had connections with relatives abroad. The relatives abroad sometimes were able to help them. And I know of one case or two or three cases in regard to Ukrainians, but it seems that in the case of the Germans and the Jews and maybe others where there was a large emigration abroad, that this was also very, very common. And Colin mentioned this, and I don't know if Edward...
I also mentioned it, yeah.
Yes.
Jewish organizations offered help, but they were told there was no hunger, no need in their help. Jewish organizations all over the world, in Germany, in America, in England and Poland, offered their help, but they were told no Jews and no Soviet citizens in general need their help at all. No. I believe there were no survivors among Jews, but the percentage of the Jews among the deceased was not so big as it was in Holocaust.
Again, if I may.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I interrupted you. Would anyone else like to come in on this?
I would like to make a quick comment. Because between Romania and USSR, there were not diplomatic relations. I'm just thinking there was not possible any deliveries from one side to another side.
Of course.
What I know, those refugees who managed to escape into Romania, Moldavians or Ukrainians, they organize themselves in different associations, but they help those who escaped. And I couldn't find any records yet that some help was provided back from the right side of the Dniester River to the left side. I don't think so, but I should go into more reading of the documents. But as of today, no such records.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay.
So there's no doubt that aid came to Mennonite communities, but how much of that aid actually made a difference is another question. I mean, to keep a family alive, you have to be sending through a lot of aid, right, in a famine. And so, people got packages, but did that just extend their lives for another 3 or 4 weeks if you didn't get another package? And I know that Mennonites working for the state often read, correspondence from Mennonites that were sending letters, and they would sometimes confiscate them, just like they confiscated packages coming in.
I believe that I believe that if any aid would be sent, it would be stolen immediately.
Yeah, well, some aid did get through, because these Mennonite letters, they talk about, well, thank you for your package, that, you know, you sent some bacon and that. But the point is that there was definitely a lot of censorship going on, and even Mennonites were participating in confiscating that aid. To what extent that made the difference between life and death, I think is a question that I'm not sure can be, determined, because to keep a family alive, you have to be sending that family an awful lot of aid through that famine to keep them alive. And so, if there's packages that are being confiscated, if there's packages that are being, seized or destroyed, I can see a lot of families getting maybe 1 or 2 packages, but will that keep them alive for a year?
Thank you. With Dr. Shlyakhter, before he goes, do you have anything to add to that? You worked, you studied the cross-border contraband trade and everything else.
Yes, sure. Well, I was actually thinking more now just about the question of foreign remittances. There's actually something I'm looking into right now at the YIVO archives. There's a long history of remittances sent from abroad. This goes into the imperial period and is resuscitated after the revolution, and is actually an important cross-border flow in the 1920s. These are legal. These are encouraged by the Soviet government because they are sources of foreign currency and the like. And so there are continuities here that I think proved important for the Jews, life-saving actually, and for the Mennonites. We don't know, as Colin said, how life-saving, but likely very significant. So I think looking at some of those antecedents also might be illuminating. Yeah.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. Oh, just a second. I have one question here. I was wondering if any of you from Irena-Skobi, I was wondering if any of you have any statistical pre-famine data collected in the 1920s on the economic situation of peasant household in minority communities. So anyone who wants to tackle that can just come right in.
I don't have any data yet.
Okay.
I have data. I have data related to Chortitza, but I'm going through it. I mean, I've gone through, government records from the early 1920s, but there are thousands and thousands of documents, and so it's not just in one place. You have to work through it to figure it out.
Okay. Okay. If we don't have any more questions, we're coming very, very near the end of the period that we have allotted to us. I will then, just a second, one more here. I agree with the point made by Dr. Shlyakhter that Holodomor and Jewish experiences, as well as Ukrainian-Jewish relations, have been understudied. There are references to the Holodomor in the Holocaust sources from Ukraine. Any comment by the panelists on that? Dr. Shlyakhter or Rina, perhaps? No?
Well, I would agree, and I would just say that the echoes of these things are very important, just as the echoes of the pogroms of the Civil War are important for explaining later Jewish attitudes and resentments persisting into the 20s and 30s. So too, the echoes of the Holodomor are, I'm sure, crucial for explaining Ukrainian attitudes in the 1940s, right? So, these are obviously difficult questions, but I think they absolutely must be confronted and illuminated.
It is absolutely understudied, and I believe personally that not only Jews, but also Ukrainians have to do more to remember Holodomor. I believe I'm not referring to this issue as a historian of Ukrainian studies, But as just common sense, I believe that Ukrainians have to invest more in remembering this tragedy. My just personal opinion, not as a lecturer in this respectful forum, but my personal opinion that Ukrainians don't do enough. And especially Ukrainians in Canada who have the opportunity, they don't deal with such issues like Ukrainians in today's Ukraine, which have to face many different political and survival and economical issues, and the very everyday and the everyday survival is not self-understood in today's Ukraine, but in Canada, where there are very many Ukrainian researchers, there has to be invested much more effort to remember Holodomor.
Thank you. I would like to point out or bring to the attention of the panelists and that there are oral history sources, recordings available at the Shoah Museum at the center, the Shoah Center at the University of Southern California. Testimonies of Holocaust survivors who do actually, some of them do actually contain also testimonies from the Holodomor period. So these sources are available, and I'm sure that they would be available elsewhere as well. If we don't have any more questions, I know that Dr. Shlyakhter has had to go. We can still continue the discussion, but if there aren't any more questions, then I think that I will just call it a very successful panel right now. And before I end the session, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, our discussant, Andrey Shlyakhter, who had to leave early as well, all of the people who took part in the discussion. And I'd like to point out that the next section, Panel 6, with the title Recent Scholarship on Bystanders to Atrocity, will take place at 14:30 or 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's about 25 minutes from now. Again, thank you everyone for your participation, for the very interesting presentations by the panelists, and also for the audience participation. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.